There is a quiet frustration that many carry but rarely express openly, a question that lingers beneath repeated words, beneath long moments of waiting, beneath the silence that follows what was spoken with hope. Why do some prayers seem to go unanswered? It is not a question of effort. Words have been spoken again and again. Time has been invested. Emotion has been poured out sincerely. And yet, the outcome often feels unchanged, as if nothing has moved, nothing has shifted, nothing has responded. At first, this creates confusion. Then it begins to create doubt. Not always loudly, not always clearly, but subtly, like a slow fading of certainty. The expectation that once felt strong begins to weaken. The confidence that once carried those words begins to feel uncertain. And over time, prayer can start to feel less like a place of power and more like a place of repetition, without result. But what if the issue is not the silence? What if the issue is not that nothing is happening, but that something is being misunderstood? There is a deeper truth that changes everything when it is seen clearly, a truth that reveals that prayer was never designed to function from a place of weakness. It was never meant to be driven by desperation, uncertainty, or a sense of distance. And yet, this is exactly how many approach it, without realizing that the position itself is limiting the outcome. There is a fundamental difference between begging and ruling. Begging comes from lack. It comes from the belief that what is needed is far away, difficult to access, and uncertain to receive. It is driven by emotion, often repeating the same words, hoping that persistence alone will create change. It carries a tone of desperation, even when it is not intentional. It sounds like reaching upward without confidence that anything will respond. Ruling, on the other hand, comes from position. It comes from understanding. It is not about demanding or controlling, but about alignment. Speaking from a place where clarity already exists. It is not driven by fear of not receiving, but by awareness of what is already established. It does not repeat endlessly, because it is not uncertain. It speaks with direction. This difference is not small, it is everything. Because the way something is approached determines the outcome that follows. Words may sound similar on the surface, but the position behind them changes their weight completely. One speaks from uncertainty, the other speaks from clarity. One focuses on what is missing, the other establishes what is true. This is where many become stuck without realizing it, not because prayer does not work, but because the approach has been shaped by misunderstanding. The cycle continues: ask, wait, repeat, without recognizing that the position has not changed. And without a shift in position, the results remain the same. This is not about effort. It is not about speaking more, trying harder, or waiting longer. It is about alignment. It is about understanding that prayer is not simply communication. It is establishment. It is not only about asking. It is about positioning. When this is not understood, frustration grows. Repetition increases, and over time, the sense of connection begins to weaken, not because it is actually gone, but because it is being approached from a place that was never designed to produce results. But the moment this truth is grasped, everything begins to shift. The focus moves away from how many times something is said, and toward how it is being said. The attention moves away from the length of prayer and toward the position behind it. The entire perspective begins to change, not gradually, but clearly. It becomes evident that prayer was never meant to be powerless. It was never meant to be uncertain. It was never meant to be driven by desperation. It was never meant to be driven by desperation. It was meant to carry authority, clarity, and direction. And until that shift happens, the cycle continues. But once it does, everything begins to move differently. Begging is often unrecognized because it does not always appear weak on the surface. It can sound sincere, passionate, even persistent. Words may be repeated with intensity, requests may be made with emotion, and effort may be poured into every moment of prayer. But beneath all of that, there is often a hidden posture, a position that shapes everything being said. That position is rooted in lack. It assumes distance. It assumes that what is being asked for is far away, uncertain, and not yet accessible. It operates from the belief that something must be convinced, something must be persuaded, something must be persuaded, something must be repeatedly requested, in hopes that it will eventually happen. And because of that, the tone becomes one of striving rather than alignment. This creates a pattern that feels active but produces very little change. Words are spoken again and again, but they carry uncertainty. Requests are made, but they are not anchored in clarity. There is effort but no direction. And over time, this repetition begins to reinforce the very thing it is trying to escape, the feeling of not having. Because whatever is focused on consistently begins to take root. When prayer is approached from lack, the focus remains on what is missing. Every repetition highlights absence instead of establishing presence. Every request reinforces the idea that something is not yet available. And this creates a cycle where the mind becomes conditioned to expect delay instead of fulfillment. This is where instability begins. Expectation rises and falls, depending on feeling. Some moments carry hope, while others carry doubt. Confidence becomes inconsistent, shifting with circumstances rather than remaining steady. And when results do not appear quickly, frustration begins to grow. That frustration is not always loud, but it is present. It shows up in subtle ways, in the questioning, in the repeated asking, in the underlying uncertainty that something might not happen at all. And as that uncertainty increases, the strength of what is being spoken begins to weaken, because words without clarity lose their weight. It is not the number of times something is said that creates impact, it is the position behind it. And when that position is uncertain, the words reflect that uncertainty, no matter how often they are repeated. This is why begging leads to exhaustion. It feels like constant effort without progress. It feels like speaking without movement. It feels like trying harder and harder without understanding why nothing seems to change. And over time, this can lead to discouragement, making prayer feel like something that must be endured rather than something that brings alignment. But the deeper issue is not the act of asking. It is the mindset behind it. Begging keeps attention fixed on the problem instead of the solution. It magnifies what is lacking instead of establishing what is available. It keeps the mind in a position of waiting rather than a position of clarity. And as long as that mindset remains, the cycle continues. Because repetition without understanding does not create results. It only reinforces the same pattern. This does not mean that effort is unnecessary or that persistence has no value. But effort without alignment leads to frustration, and persistence without clarity leads to repetition without direction. Standing in authority changes this completely. It shifts the focus away from convincing and toward establishing. It removes the need to repeat endlessly because there is no uncertainty behind what is being said. It replaces instability with steadiness, doubt with clarity, and lack with awareness. But before that shift can happen, the pattern of begging must be recognized. It must be seen clearly, not as something intentional, but as something learned over time, a way of approaching prayer that feels natural, but was never meant to define it. And once it is recognized, it can be changed, because the problem is not that prayer is ineffective. The problem is that position determines outcome. And until the position shifts, the results will remain the same. When the mindset shifts away from begging, something powerful begins to take its place: authority. Not loud, not forceful, not rooted in control, but steady, clear, and grounded in understanding. Authority does not come from emotion. It comes from position. It is the awareness that what is being spoken is not uncertain, not distant, and not dependent on repeated persuasion. Praying from authority changes everything at its core. It removes the sense of distance. It removes the idea that what is being asked for is far away or difficult to reach. Instead, it brings everything into alignment with what is already established. It is no longer about trying to obtain something that feels out of reach. It is about recognizing what is already available and bringing it into expression with clarity. This shift transforms the tone completely. Instead of repeating requests, there is precision. Instead of speaking from uncertainty, there is confidence. Words are no longer driven by fear of not receiving. They are guided by understanding of what is already in place. This does not make prayer less sincere. It makes it more effective. Authority is not about demanding. It is about aligning. It is the difference between hoping something might change and declaring what must align. It is the difference between speaking without direction and speaking with intention. It is not rooted in desperation, but in clarity that does not need to prove itself. And this clarity changes how words are formed. There is no confusion behind them, no hesitation within them. Each word carries direction, purpose, and certainty. It is not about saying more. It is about saying what matters with understanding. Even a few words spoken with clarity carry more weight than many words spoken without it. This also changes expectation. Expectation is no longer unstable, rising and falling with circumstances. It becomes steady. There is no need to constantly question whether something will happen, because the position itself has already established the direction. The focus is no longer on if, but on alignment. This does not mean that everything becomes immediate, but it means that everything becomes clear. There is a difference between waiting in doubt and standing in assurance. Waiting in doubt creates tension, uncertainty, and frustration. Standing in assurance creates peace, stability, and confidence, even before results are visible. This is what authority produces. It removes the pressure of trying to make something happen and replaces it with the confidence that alignment has already been set. It shifts attention away from the problem and places it firmly on what is true. And as this becomes consistent, something deeper begins to happen. The mind becomes more focused. Thoughts become more aligned. There is less distraction, less confusion, less emotional fluctuation. Everything begins to stabilize around understanding instead of uncertainty. This is why authority is not just about words. It is about mindset. It is about how something is approached before anything is even spoken. Because what is believed internally will always show what is expressed externally. And when that internal position is clear, the external expression carries that same clarity. Authority also removes the need for constant repetition, not because persistence is wrong, but because repetition, driven by uncertainty, is no longer necessary. Instead of asking again and again out of fear, there is a steady reinforcement of what has already been established. This brings a sense of rest, not passivity, but confidence, not inactivity, but stability. A knowing that what has been aligned does not need to be questioned repeatedly. It remains steady, regardless of external conditions. And this is where prayer becomes powerful again. Not as a routine, not as a habit driven by obligation, but as a position of clarity that shapes everything that follows. Because when prayer is approached from authority, it is no longer about trying to reach something distant. It becomes about aligning with what is already true and allowing everything else to follow from that place. The moment the mindset shifts from begging to authority, something fundamental begins to change, not just in words, but in perception, expectation, and internal stability. It is not a gradual adjustment that goes unnoticed. It is a clear and defining transition that reshapes how everything is approached. Before this shift, there is often tension, a sense of striving, a constant movement of asking, waiting, wondering, and repeating. The mind stays active, searching for signs, questioning outcomes, and trying to measure whether anything is actually happening. There is effort, but it feels scattered. There is hope, but it feels uncertain. But when the shift happens, that entire pattern begins to dissolve. The need to constantly repeat begins to fade, not because persistence is no longer valued, but because uncertainty is no longer driving the repetition. Words become re-intentional, fewer, but stronger, clearer, but more grounded. What is spoken carries weight, not because of volume, but because of alignment. This shift also stabilizes expectation. Instead of rising and falling based on circumstances, expectation becomes steady. It is no longer dependent on what is seen immediately. It is no longer shaken by delays or challenged by silence. It stands firm, not because everything is visible, but because the position itself is clear. There is a difference between hoping something will happen and knowing that something has been established. Hope, when rooted in uncertainty, can weaken over time. It depends on signs, on visible movement, on confirmation. But knowing does not depend on any of those things. It remains steady even when nothing appears to change on the surface. This is where frustration begins to disappear. Because frustration often comes from repetition without result, from effort without visible movement, from expectation that feels unsupported. But when authority replaces begging, that frustration loses its foundation. There is no longer a sense of striving without direction. Everything is aligned, even if it is not yet fully visible. This does not mean that patience is no longer required. But patience changes in nature. It is no longer passive, waiting filled with doubt. It becomes confident, waiting filled with clarity, a steady awareness that what has been established does not need to be forced into existence, It will align in its time because the position behind it is already correct. This shift also affects the internal environment. The mind becomes quieter. There is less overthinking, less questioning, less emotional fluctuation. Thus, no longer move in circles. Instead, they settle into clarity. There is a sense of order that replaces confusion, a sense of calm that replaces urgency. This internal stability becomes one of the most noticeable changes, because when the mind is no longer driven by lack, it stops searching for constant reassurance. It no longer needs to analyze every detail or revisit every concern. It rests in understanding instead of striving for confirmation. There is also a new level of confidence that emerges, not based on external results, but based on internal alignment. Even before anything changes visibly, there is a certainty that the direction is set, that what has been established will not be undone by temporary circumstances. This confidence is quiet, but powerful. It does not need to prove itself. It does not fluctuate with conditions. It remains steady, anchored in clarity rather than emotion. And as this becomes consistent, everything begins to respond differently. Decisions become clearer, focus becomes sharper, distractions lose their hold. There is less confusion about what to do and more alignment with what needs to be done. Life begins to feel less reactive and more directed. This is the true impact of the shift. It is not just about prayer. It is about perspective. It is about moving from a position of uncertainty into a position of clarity that influences every part of life. Because once this shift takes place, nothing is approached the same way again. The cycle of begging is broken, and in its place a new pattern begins, one defined by authority, stability, and alignment, that continues to shape outcomes far beyond what was previously experienced. This is the moment where everything that has been understood must become something that is lived. Awareness alone is not enough. Recognition alone is not enough. The shift only becomes real when it is applied consistently, intentionally, and without returning to the old pattern. There must be a clear decision, a line drawn between how things were approached before and how they would be approached from this point forward. Stop begging. Not gradually, not occasionally. Completely. Stop repeating words driven by uncertainty. Stop approaching prayer from a place of lack. Stop speaking as if what is needed is distant, unreachable, or uncertain, because continuing in that position will only reproduce the same results again and again. Instead, step fully into authority. Let every word be shaped by clarity. Let every statement come from understanding, not desperation. Speak with direction, not confusion. Speak with direction, not confusion. Speak with confidence, not hesitation. This is not about increasing volume or intensity. It is about shifting position. Make this a daily discipline, not something practiced only in moments of need, but something that becomes the foundation of how everything is approached. Consistency is what transforms understanding into reality. One moment of clarity can inspire change, but repeated alignment is what sustains it. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. The habit of repetition, the instinct to ask again out of uncertainty, may try to return, but do not go back. Recognize it immediately and correct it. Replace uncertainty with clarity. Replace repetition with intentional declaration. This is where discipline becomes essential, not forced but focused. A steady commitment to remain aligned regardless of what is seen or not seen. Because results do not define the position defines the results. And if the position remains steady, the outcome will follow in time. There will be moments where it feels easier to return to old patterns. Moments where silence may try to create doubt. Moments where visible results may not appear immediately. But those are the exact moments where authority must remain firm. Do not measure alignment by immediate outcomes. Measure it by consistency. Measure it by clarity. Measure it by the refusal to return to uncertainty. This is where real strength is built. Not when everything is visible, but when everything is still unseen and alignment remains unshaken. Let this shift go beyond words. Let it shape thinking. Let it influence decisions. Let it define how challenges are approached. Because authority is not limited to prayer. It becomes a way of living, a way of responding, a way of maintaining clarity in every situation. Over time, this consistency creates a noticeable difference, not just in outcomes but in mindset. There is less striving, less frustration, less confusion. In its place comes stability, confidence, and direction. And when this becomes natural, everything begins to align without force, because what is established with clarity does not need to be repeated endlessly. It remains. So begin now. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. Make the decision to change position completely. Refuse to return to begging. Refuse to speak without understanding. Refuse to allow uncertainty to shape what is declared. Call to action. From this moment forward, approach every prayer with authority, speak with clarity, stand with confidence, and remain consistent until what has been established becomes visible.